I'm Katie Wegner, President of WISE DFW. Welcome to our fourth and final webinar event. Our three organizations, BSP North Texas, WISE DFW, and DICE, have spent the last 8 weeks bringing together industry leaders to have real conversations about how we all can be a part of the change within our sports community. Today's webinar is focused on highlighting professionals and organizations in our industry that are at the forefront of change. As part of today's conversation, we will continue to provide you with resources and tools on how you can make an impact in your personal and professional life. Now I would like to turn it over to Larry Lundy, President of BSP North Texas.
Thanks, Katie. As President of Black Sports Professionals North Texas, we're honored to partner with DICE and WISE to bring you this historic webinar series. It's been really a game changer for us here at our organization, and we have to thank our two speakers today who really embody what our mantra is of taking action. When you think about Gail taking on the diversity role of the Mavericks at the time she did, and actually partnering and sponsoring all our organizations to bring you programming like this, that takes a lot of courage and a lot of action. And you think of Kim Davis going to national organizations like the Black Journalists Convention or Black NBA Convention, taking the National Hockey League with her. A lot of people were curious about that, but after she speaks, she always had the longest line in the room. So the point of this is that you don't have to be the chief diversity officer or a leader of organization to make a difference. And we're challenging everybody to make a difference in your own personal lives and as we go forward to make a personal change at your office. With that, I'd like to turn it over to the president of DICE, Carla Rosenberg.
Thank you, Larry and Katie. I can't believe we've come to the end of this webinar series. It's been an absolute privilege to work together and provide a roadmap for change to DFW sports and entertainment industry professionals. I want to note that just because this 2-month initiative run has ended, that doesn't mean we're done making changes. If anything, we're just getting started. You're going to see that in our DICE Fast Pitch virtual content series that kicks off next week. But today we're grateful to culminate the series with two powerhouse women doing powerful work in two of our country's biggest sports. I met Kim Davis 2 years ago at NHL League meetings in Michigan and heard her speak again later that year at a diversity and inclusion event in Las Vegas with Billie Jean King. Kim served as the moderator for a panel I was on, and I kept thinking to myself, I would much rather hear from Kim than listen to what I have to say. So good thing for you all, Kim is here today to share her insight. Kim has been recognized by the Hockey News as one of their 2020 top 100 most influential leaders in the sport. Essence Magazine, Adweek, the Sports Business Journal, Savoy Magazine, you name it. They've all recognized her for her impact in sport and beyond. She's the Senior Executive Vice President of Social Impact, Growth Initiatives, and Legislative Affairs at the National Hockey League, and I'm thrilled she agreed to join us today. In addition, we're fortunate to have another superstar to guide us in this discussion today. Gail OBannon serves as Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion with the Dallas Mavericks. Gail knows what it takes to advance a workplace culture, as hers is just the second team in the NBA to specifically have someone focused on inclusion and diversity. Thank you both for being here today, and I'm happy to pass it off to Gail to get this conversation started.
Thank you, Carla.
Thank you.
Really appreciate that. And I want to thank Larry and thank Katie for the opportunity to be here today. The Dallas Mavericks, we are, as Larry mentioned, corporate sponsors of all three organizations, and couldn't be more proud and to have our employees to be a part of all three organizations. So I will do a plug right here for you and say, if your company is not, be a corporate sponsor to all three. And if they don't, then you do it yourself. It is definitely worth it. And just want to put that plug in. I want to shout out to the Mavs family that's out there watching today. And I'm going to shout out to the Dallas Stars because we are here with Kim Davis. And hi, Kim.
Hey, Gail, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. We have a short period of time to cover a lot of information. So I'm just going to get started. You are the Senior Executive Vice President, and I'm going to do this whole title. Social impact, right? Social impact, growth initiatives and legislative affairs. Tell us, what does that mean? What is your responsibilities?
Well, that's a mouthful, isn't it, Gail? We simply refer to it as the SGL group. I think that's probably the easiest. Ultimately, what I have responsibility for is helping to think about how we grow the sport of hockey, particularly as we think about the future fans and fans in waiting. Those fans that we aspire to have be part of the sport, and we do that through a couple of ways. One is by influencing the youth hockey ecosystem. So how do we bring more fans to our sport through youth hockey? Secondly, we do that through our community engagement and community relations, working with all of our clubs across North America in building stronger, more vibrant communities through the sport of hockey. I also have responsibility for the NHL Foundation in that regard. And then how do we create a welcoming culture and create an environment where our sport is actually seen as a sport for all, clearly being very transparent and authentic about the fact that, right now, 93% of our players are white. And so, how do we develop those players as allies so that they understand what the growth trajectory of our sport is and how we all play a role as leaders in helping to usher in the future. So that's the work that I'm responsible for.
And very important work it is, especially when we talk about youth sports and our kids today, and especially in this environment right now with COVID. So if you want to talk a little bit about that, I know everything, some kids are in school, some kids are not in school, and the importance of that, if you would just touch on that one more time, because it's the same thing in basketball. We're looking at youth sports and it's really important. If you could just expand just a little bit on the programs that you are doing.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you think about our communities, one of the most important assets and attributes of our communities is our ability to rally around families. And whether you're a parent or not, you play some role in being part of the village in a community of bringing children together. And so we see hockey as sitting at the center of that. Again, using the sport of hockey to teach life skills, using the sport of hockey as a way to engage families and to help children be healthy. And so in this age of COVID, we know that a lot of families are struggling. And sport is an outlet for many families, and they don't have that outlet. So what we've tried to do is to use our authentic assets to bring some kind of support and relief to families during this period, while also thinking about what is life going to look like post-COVID and how do we support youth hockey going forward. In the sport of hockey, a lot of ice rinks are struggling to even stay afloat. The cost of keeping their operations going has been something that has been terribly concerning for many of them. And so we've been working behind the scenes on helping them create protocols, finding funding, ways in which to keep their facilities alive. We've also spent time working on how do we make those environments safe? How do we use the same protocols that we used in the bubble and take those same protocols to help many of these fledgling communities, these fledgling ice rinks, know how to make the environment safe. So, how do you use your natural assets during this period of COVID, I think is important. But more importantly, how do you keep communities positive and thinking about what life will look like afterwards? Because there is going to be an afterlife.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We will get to the other side of this and we will be able to do this together. So you have a successful career in corporate America. So what led you to the decision to take on the role that you're in today? What's going on there?
Well, mine is quite a complicated story, but I'll start at the end and say I have always been a believer, and I spent over 30 years in financial services. I've always been a believer in being able to reinvent yourself and to be able to understand that your core skills and competencies are very transferable. And I think my career is a great example of how you can not grow up in a particular industry or sport and still be a major contributor. And hopefully it's an inspiration, particularly the kids of color and young women, that you can have a career in a sport like hockey and be a woman or a woman of color or a person of color. I had the opportunity to meet Commissioner Bettman 3.5 years ago. I was a consultant and I did some work for the NHL. And he was really thinking about what the next 100 years of hockey would look like. Hockey had just celebrated its centennial, its first 100 years. And that was very much defined by growth and technology and expansion. But it was clear that the next 100 years was going to be focused on speed and culture and the ability to engage new audiences. And so we had some very interesting conversations about that, which led to him creating this position that I have, which was a newly created position. It took some pieces that existed in the organization and created some new elements. And now I'm one of 2 women that sit around the senior executive table for the NHL.
Congratulations on that. Congratulations. And just touch on is when we talk about sports and major sports, professional sports and basketball, NBA, NHL, there are women behind the scenes. And we get out and support our communities. And we want girls and brown girls and Black girls to know that there is a place for you in sports. So thank you for touching on that. I think that was really important to say. And so I've been doing a little bit of homework, and I saw where that hockey has hockey for everyone. Hockey has for everyone. Tell us a little bit about those initiatives and just the sentiment behind it.
Yeah, what's interesting about hockey is that, just the nature of hockey, the humility of the sport, that's clearly an endearing quality and trait. But it's also in many ways a blind side in terms of the sport not really letting the public know its history and all of the positive things that it has done. And so Hockey is for Everyone is one of those examples. It's a program and an initiative that's been in place for over 27 years that was started by the first Black executive at the NHL, Bryant McBride. And I mentioned his name because he ultimately ended up being the executive producer for a documentary on Willie O'Ree, who was the first Black to break the color barrier in hockey in 1958 with the Boston Bruins. And Brian started this program in the early 90s to bring Black and brown and kids from various different backgrounds together to understand that the sport of hockey had some endearing qualities, helped build great life skills, and to expose kids all over North America to the sport. Willie O'Ree became the ambassador for that sport. He's been doing it for 25 years. And across North America, there are 27 of these programs that focus on minority kids playing the sport of hockey. And so this, often when people hear Hockey is for Everyone, they think it's something that I initiated 3 years ago when I joined the league, and it's not true. It's something that's been going on for almost 3 decades. And I think it's a proud point for the sport that we have to continue to illuminate more.
I love it. Just continuing to build bridges. Just building bridges to our community and touching our youth is so important.
Yeah.
So at the Mavericks, and I know it's the league level in the Mavericks, but I think this is all going to come together here. We have our Dallas Mavericks Advisory Council. We call it DMAC, and internally we have the MIC, which is our Mavs Inclusion Council, and that focuses in, and our Advisory Council advises us, keeps us in checks and balance in place. And then internally, we're looking at our inclusion pillars and what we have. You came up with an executive council.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, I mean, much like you just described at the Mavs level, which is critically important, the league, as with all leagues, serve the clubs. And so one of the ways in which I've tried to establish my relationship with club leadership and ownership is to say that they should view me as a consultant to them, someone that can help develop models and frameworks that we can then institutionalize and create systems across the entire enterprise. And so we put an architecture in place that we think is going to be enduring long term. So, you know, when I'm gone from the league, or when Commissioner Bettman is gone, this architecture becomes and influences the DNA of our sport. So this Executive Inclusion Council is made up of owners, presidents, general managers of the league, and they have three important goals. One is to be a repository of information and to be listeners. We've created committees across the 32 clubs that are making recommendations to the Executive Inclusion Council. So the council is not to be the doers, they are to be the listeners, and the body to be accountable for the action. Secondly, they are responsible for not just listening, but establishing metrics and milestones that we can then measure the effectiveness of the work that we're doing across DEI over the course of the next 3, 5, 10 years, because this is a long game. This is not something that we're going to solve overnight. And thirdly, they need to be brave and courageous leaders in determining what resources we need across the league in order to effectuate change, and to take their recommendations to ultimately the Board of Governors, which are the owners of all 32 clubs, for implementation and execution. So that committee has a pretty clear mandate, and they have bought into that mandate and own that.
So for our audience, I'm just going to repeat, they need to be listeners. Number one, they're going to measure matrix and milestones, and then
Metrics.
leaders.
That's
very,
it.
Very important. Very
Yeah.
important.
Whether
So
they say if you can't measure it, it doesn't matter.
there you go. It's really that simple. You can't. You truly, truly can't. So at the Mavs, we have our CEO, Sid Marshall.
She's the girl.
She is a phenomenal leader, and she is a champion in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We are so lucky to have her leading us in this space. And so it is just part of her DNA. It is cultivated into our culture and our DNA that we're working on. And so what I wanted to ask you tell us a little bit about the CEO and their role, that they truly play a very important role when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
I think this is so important. I appreciate you asking the question, because this is a conversation that I have had with owners and presidents of our clubs over the past couple of years. And I believe fundamentally that the CEO has to be the chief diversity officer in order for change to truly take place. I think that in high performing organizations, and this has been substantiated by data, when the CEO owns responsibility and accountability for making change around diversity, inclusion, and culture, things happen. So, you know, it's great to have a team of people. It's great to have content expertise in the DEI space, but the CEO has to see him or herself as the chief diversity officer for this to really, in my opinion, really take hold and for change to really be made.
I agree. Just being in the space and just watching our culture just go through a transformation, and the people that I talk to and colleagues, that's it. I mean, you just hit the nail on the head. So I can't wait to go back and just retitle until we're going to add some more to your title. Here we go. Okay, so you recently wrote about ice hockey, and I'm going to quote you on this. You said, while the game is not renowned for diversity, I believe it is nonetheless poised to become the most inclusive sport in the world. Explain to our viewers today why you feel that way.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think to truly step into the moment of change and to turn that moment into movement, begins with being authentic about where your opportunities and your obstacles are. And so there is no reason, and I've said this to our leadership, for us to shy away or to be embarrassed by the facts of who we are. We are a sport made up of 93% of our players are white. Instead of thinking about that as an impediment to change as it relates to inclusion, let's look at that through the lens of opportunity. We have an opportunity to take 93% of our sport and turn them into authentic allies for the future. And just imagine if we are able to build that kind of trust relationship with those players, what influence they can have on every part of our ecosystem, particularly our fan base, who you look up to these players. So that's number one. In this quest for equity across all of the dimensions of intersectionality, we ought to be using our assets in a positive way and not looking at it through the lens of anything negative. We ought to be thinking about the positive. That's number one. Number two is that we have an opportunity, because we can learn from others' mistakes, on how to accelerate our progress and to get it right quicker. And again, we shouldn't spend time apologizing for what we haven't done. We should get on with the business of getting it done. And so that's the conversation that I have with our clubs as we look at, how do we understand what our baseline is so that we can set meaningful metrics for the future. How do we build strong, brave, courageous leaders in anti-racism work and explain and educate our folks on what that looks like and how that shows up. And so that's what we are trying to do, is to take this moment, accelerate it, turn it into a movement, and turn all the emotion that we've experienced over the past 8 months into real action for change.
Get on with the business of getting it done. I'm using that again. You're so right. You are so right. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I know we talked about the pandemic of COVID, and there's the economy out there. We'll stay away from that for a little bit, but social injustice. So at the Mavs, after the murder of George Floyd, we pulled together our Black employees. We had conversations with our staff. We have courageous conversations with the public. We've created experiences of understanding. We have small groups. I mean, the list goes on. And then we have Mavs Take Action. It is a 40-item initiative. You can go out to mavs.com, Mavs Take Action, and look at what those initiatives are. Tell us, how did the social injustice issues in our country have an impact with the hockey in the league, diversity, equity, inclusion, both internally and then externally?
Yeah. So, a huge deal for us in the sport of hockey, again, looking at the demographic makeup of both our fan base and our players. When George Floyd was murdered, for the first time, I for sure, since I've been with the league, and I think in the history of the league, from what I understand, our players stood up. 126 of our players used their social platforms to talk about the injustice of the murder of George Floyd. That's never happened in the history of hockey. First of all, our sport, just the players don't show up that way on any particular issue. Again, a sport that by principle is very humble. The players don't speak out. 32% of our players are from outside of the United States. And so diversity plays out very differently in our sport. 126 of those players stood up and said, this is a human rights issue and we need to stand up and educate ourselves on what role we can play in this change effort. And I think the key word here is educate. I can't tell you the number of calls that I got from players and agents and leaders in the clubs asking me to have conversations with players, asking for resources that players could read or podcasts they could listen to so that they could educate themselves on the issues. And I think that's so important in any arena. Most of the time, people don't feel comfortable speaking out on issues because they don't want to say the wrong thing. And I think, again, this is an area where we have to be bold and courageous in saying, I don't know something, right? And by the way, just because you're a person of color doesn't mean that you have the corner knowledge on all these issues either. We are all learners and we're all listeners. And so that was major for us. And so then it became, how do we take that and continue to accelerate that and to use players' voices to affect change? And so we have a player committee at the league level that's been put together, players across all dimensions. So female players, LGBTQ players, Black, brown players that are coming together to make recommendations to the executive council on what we can do to make the sport more welcoming, how we can create a stronger pipeline of players of color to the elite level, and how we can influence the youth hockey ecosystem by having the players be mentors and sponsors in communities. And this is a big deal. It's not that players didn't do some of this work before, but we never had a concerted effort with everybody rowing in the same direction around this kind of work. And that's what I'm most excited about.
Extremely important. It is about human rights and humanity. It is about changing hearts and minds. And then that comes with the education. So
yes,
I applaud those 126 players and you and the NHL for the work that you're doing to educate and continue to inform. I think it's extremely important. And then, like you said, I think it's a movement that will continue to move. This is not just a moment. It will continue to evolve. And I just commend you for that. I think it's awesome.
Thank you, Gail.
That is so great. Okay, so here comes some fun stuff. You were recently named by Sports Illustrated as one of the unrelenting, the most powerful, most influential, most outstanding woman in sports right now. Congratulations.
Wow, that was a surprise.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm gonna say it again. Congratulations. Everybody in the audience can't hear you, so hopefully everyone's typing that in the chat. Congratulations, congratulations. That is huge, and that is awesome to just appreciate the work that you've done. So here we go. So what do you think about, how do you feel like mainstream legacy in this conversation, acknowledging the contributions of the underserved communities in sports and the women and what's going on?
Well, look, I've been doing change work for a long time. I'm a grandmother, and so I've seen a lot, and hopefully have done a lot. But at this point in my career, for me, it's about empowering the next generation of leaders. And so whatever I can do to be a role model, to be an influencer, and to use my power and my privilege to help make things better particularly for young people of color, and specifically women and women of color. That's what I will do. I think it takes bold and courageous leaders to affect change. And that doesn't mean those in the C-suite. It means that we have to be leaders at every level, and we have to be self-aware of what power we have and how we can use that, and not always look for somebody else to do it for us. But we have to push the envelope. And I think I've always been an envelope pusher, even as a young professional. Because I saw that, and that behavior was modeled for me by my grandmother and my grandfather and my mother and many in my community. So I'm honored and humbled by the SI recognition, but I hope it is an inspiration for others to know that they can achieve this as well.
So Congressman John Lewis passed away here recently. Before he did, he left a great message for us about good trouble and necessary trouble. And so I don't know where you live in that space of trouble, but I feel like I'm in it. I'm all in the mix of it.
I'm all about good trouble. I am a constructive agitator for sure.
All right. I think sometimes I just get straight in trouble. I mean, it's what it is. So talk to us about this. We are 6 days away from a monumental election that's coming up. And I know there's been a lot of effort put in from all leagues, players alike. The importance of casting, not right now, we're past registered to vote. If you haven't registered to vote, you're out of the game, but really just to cast your ballot, early voting or election day, just depending on your state. Talk to us a little bit about the importance of that.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's my lived experience to have actually had over my lifetime the experience of not being able to go into places and spaces because of how I look and the color of my skin. You know, I can remember traveling with my grandparents to the South from Chicago, which is where I was born and I grew up, and not being able to stop in restaurants or drink out of water fountains in the 1960s. This is my lived experience. It's not something I read about, right? I experienced it. And so, you know, I sat on my grandfather's knee and listened to him talk about the journey that his mother and his relatives had, laying railroad track from North Carolina to Georgia for a better life, and what they went through and what he went through in a small town in Georgia. And so to not take civic responsibility and voting and the right to lead in that way seriously is something I can't even imagine. And so I do everything, and I'm involved in organizations like the Links, where we are deeply involved in Get Out the Vote. And, you know, I've just been so pleased with the way many of our clubs have stepped up and they're using their stadiums as polling places. And again, this is not about who you're voting for. This is about you exercising your civic responsibility as a citizen to stand up and take action. And that is what I think is so critically important, particularly for this election.
You're extreme. I mean, I started to feel my blood pressure go up a little bit just listening to just the snippet of the story that you talked about with your parents and grandparents. And I feel the same way. It is, people lost their lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
People have lost their lives and fought for us to have the right to vote as Black people, people of color, and women. And so truly important. And when I walked into the polling facilities and have done for several years, I'm not just taking myself, I'm taking my ancestors with me.
That's right.
It's so important. So I hope that everyone out here, whether your weather starts to get a little dreary or crazy or there's snow, get out there, put on whatever you need to do, but definitely go and cast your ballot. It is important to do so.
Absolutely.
All right, let's talk to the women. Let's talk to the women out here. We got WISE and all of that and some other. So let's talk to the women viewers. So what advice do you want to share for the women? What advice do you have for what do you have for us?
Well, I got a lot to say, but we don't have all that time. So I'll start by saying, as women, I think one of the most important things from my point of view is that we first and foremost support each other. I think it's just so important for us to understand that often men are watching how we support each other in terms of how they show up as allies. And I say that specifically because the experiences across gender, race, and ethnicity are very different. And the data proves it out. If you look at women as example on corporate boards, white women represent about 19.8, roughly 20% of corporate boards, but women of color represent 3%. If you look at pay, white women, 81 cents on the dollar for men, but women of color, African-American women, somewhere around 57 cents, Hispanic, 56, and I think Asian, 54. And so these are data points that show that intersection of race, ethnicity, and gender, that triple threat, I often call it, is serious. And we as women have to, one, understand it, appreciate it, and support each other in lifting us all up. Because the truth of the matter is the greatest growth in our gender demographic will be women of color over the course of the next 25 years. And so, let's demonstrate, let's model the behavior that we seek in terms of men being allies to us by being good allies to each other.
Let's go, women. Let's go, women. We got to do this. We got to do this. I think it's going to be awesome. All right. I'm going to ask my final question before we open it up to questions. So what advice would you give to those individuals or an organization who feel like they are the underdogs in the position of being able to champion diversity, equity, and inclusion in their organization?
I guess the first thing I would say is, in building this inclusion muscle, I think what sits at the base of it is leadership. And I think, again, it takes bold and courageous leadership in order to move forward on these issues, particularly when you felt like you were behind. The first thing is that you've got to rumble with vulnerability. In order for you to really begin to embrace the kind of change that's necessary around D&I, you have to be vulnerable. You have to know that everything you do isn't going to be right. You're going to make mistakes, and you have to be willing not to retreat when people criticize you. And so that's the first step in the journey, as far as I'm concerned, is rumbling with vulnerability and being comfortable with the fact that this is a journey, not an event, and you're going to have to, go through some tough times to get to the other side.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So we're going to open it up for questions. For those who have questions, to use the Q&A area. We have one question that's here. You may know a little bit more about this than I do, but it says, from a content marketing standpoint, how have you been able to leverage the documentary of Willie O'Ree? Did I say O'Ree?
O'Ree, yes.
O'Ree, okay. And any related content?
Yeah, so we have been working with the producers on taking the documentary and turning it into educational content that we can use in school systems to teach anti-racism. And that content is going to be rolled out systematically across North America starting around the end of first quarter next year. It was always the producer's intent to use this as a teachable tool, particularly for youth, so that they could take on the attributes of hockey around perseverance, humility, acceptance, courage, and to teach kids how to be stronger and better citizens, particularly anti-racist work. So that work is underway, and you'll hear more about it in early 2021.
Let's see here. Here's a question. Can you tell us what are some of the best practices that you're seeing and ways that the league office and teams can help each other in areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, we've tried to put a framework together, and we're actually doing economic analysis now across the 32 clubs to just get a snapshot on where our clubs are. But we've identified 6 dimensions that we think are best practices in the DEI space. The first is leadership, and that is, what kind of structures do you have in place to bring voices from outside of yourself into the decision-making process, much like the committees and the councils that we've put in place? The second is around education. Are you creating the opportunity from the top of the organization to the bottom to engage in anti-racism, cross-cultural, cultural competency education, different than training, because we're not talking about check the box, but we're talking about changing mindsets and behaviors and culture, which is the second dimension. The third is around economic inclusion. What relationships are you building with diverse and women-owned suppliers in your market to really share and include them in the economic process with regard to the way in which you are spending money in your communities? The fourth is around community relations. How are you partnering with organizations, not just through a charitable lens, but through a growth lens, to help use the sport of hockey to build stronger, more vibrant communities? And the fifth is participation. How are you specifically providing programming to BIPOC kids so that we are growing the pipeline of talent that doesn't necessarily end up just being on the ice, but also can serve our front office, and we can create opportunities across the entire ecosystem in terms of improved representation. So we're using that as a framework, and we're asking all the clubs to not be embarrassed about where they are, but for us to be able to consult with them to help them move all of those dimensions over the course of the next few years in a positive direction.
Kim, our time is up. Much love to you. Thank you so much for this conversation. I appreciate it. I want to thank DICE and WISE, DFW, and BSP North Texas, and all of the viewers who have committed their time this afternoon to join us in this conversation. Hopefully we'll continue this somewhere down the road. I'm sure our paths will cross on the other side of COVID, where we can be in the space together. If you have any closing remarks, I'll let you close it out, and then we're going to send it back to Carla.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you for such a great conversation. I appreciate everyone on this call, and everyone stay safe and healthy.
Stay safe and healthy, everyone, and vote, 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 vote. Don't forget to vote. Carla, turning it back over to you.
Thank you, Kim and Gail, for that enlightening and inspirational discussion. And thanks to all our members at BSP, DICE, and WISE for tuning in and recognizing the opportunity and need to affect change. I want to give a special shout out of gratitude to Lauren Allison, Katie Wagner, Larry Lundy, Hunter Harvin, Nicole Brittenreicher, Breon Dennis, Natalie Jenkins, Megan Eisenhard, Kern Egan, and Quashawn Lockett for all your amazing hard work behind the scenes. You're our unsung heroes. And together we've created a roadmap we hope has inspired you and provided you with helpful tools to make a meaningful difference. As our speakers have shown us, and as we have witnessed over the past few months, those in our industry can make that impact. I challenge you, and I challenge myself to do so. We're going to be putting those tools together into a DEI playbook, once you'll be able to access for free at DFWSportsUnitedInAction.com. We look forward to experiencing the change you use these insights to bring about. The more individuals who take responsibility for doing the right thing, the greater the chances the right thing will get done. So from everyone at DFW Sports United in Action, thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.